Well, good evening, everybody. It is Saturday night. Okay, it's 8 o'clock. Joe Firestone here for Rio Progressives. And my guest for tonight is Richard Dien Winfield. He's running for Congress in the Georgia 10th. He's been with us a few times before. He's one of our favorite candidates, or should be one of our favorite candidates by now. He's been running on a federal job guarantee for a long time, and he has a very progressive platform which offers people a new social bill of rights, and is extremely comprehensive. So tonight he's going to talk to us about the state of the race in the Georgia 10th, and he's also going to give us a feel for the environment and what it will take to win there, and what are the major issues that are now beginning to come front and center in his campaign. So I'm going to turn things over to Richard, who will give you a summary of things in the Georgia 10th District. Okay, Richard, go ahead.
Well, I've now been an official candidate since January, and the primary race is coming to a head. Actually, early voting has already begun. The primary itself is May 22nd. I'm now facing two other Democratic candidates, both of whom I think one could characterize as sort of mainstream Democratic candidates, whereas I'm pushing the envelope. And, there have been some interesting developments since I last spoke to you. Both of whom I think one could characterize as sort of mainstream Democratic candidates, whereas I'm pushing.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. Now, on the one hand, my race itself has been penetrating a wider and wider audience. To some degree, I had been trying to meet with whatever Democratic Party local organizations there would be, with various kinds of social activist groups. I've been attending a lot of Sunday church services in African American churches, which will allow me to address the congregations. Since I am a union member of the Communication Workers of America, which is attempting to organize all employees at the University of Georgia, I've been speaking to meetings with many locals of the Communication Workers of America in the general area of the 10th District and on the outskirts of Atlanta. I've met also with a local steelworkers union meeting. I went recently to a UPS facility, and the Teamster local head had me speak to UPS employees as they came out during shifts. So I've also been speaking at veterans groups. I've been speaking at senior centers. And although most of my audience are Democratic voters, who are primarily African Americans, especially when you leave the university town of Athens, I have been getting into contact with a fair number of, I guess you could say, white working class people who are, identifying themselves as Republicans. And I know that one of the big questions I had to address with certain people, particularly in the Athens liberal community, is whether my very bold social rights agenda, anchored in guaranteed jobs at fair wages, would be something that could possibly win sufficient support in the general election. There are those who want to say that in effect one has to pander to the Republicans and move towards the center as much as possible. And that's more or less what my two opponents are tending to do. But I found that I'm getting an extremely favorable response, both from the African Americans I'm meeting when I'm going to various events outside Athens and in Athens and at Democratic Party meetings, which are predominantly African American when you get out of Athens. But I'm also getting a very favorable response among, I guess you could call it, the white working class that I encounter. And in a certain respect, I'm also getting a bit more national attention. That's also reflected in the success of our fundraising efforts. Adi Barkan, who I think many of you know of, a political activist who's head of a Center for Popular Democracy, who now is wheelchair bound because of advancing ALS. He was excited by my campaign, in particular my advocacy of a federal job guarantee. And he came down from California to spend a day campaigning with me. And he was particularly interested to see in how people were responding to the message I was putting out there. And two events in particular, I think, were very striking to him. One was we spent part of an afternoon canvassing in two very different kind of communities. One was a public housing development outside Monroe, Georgia, which is in Walton County, what could be considered one of the most Republican strongholds in the state of Georgia, perhaps in the country. It's also the site of a very notorious double lynching, whose perpetrators have never been identified or prosecuted. But we went to a public housing project and also to a trailer park. At the public housing project, the residents were predominantly African American, and that has been the case when I've gone canvassing in any similar housing projects. The residents were extremely favorably inclined to what I was presenting, in stressing the idea of wiping out unemployment, wiping out poverty wages, balancing work and family, leveling the playing field between employer and employee. I would say more than 95% of the people I canvassed were ready to say they would vote for me and were willing to give me their phone number to call them. When I went to a trailer park, whose residents were entirely white, and almost all of whom identified themselves as Republicans, I got almost as strong a response. I would say about 85% signed on to vote for me. Primarily because they are concerned about joblessness and job security. They are concerned about not having wages that are sufficient to live on. They're also concerned about employment at will and the fact that they can be fired without any recourse in the absence of any kind of unionization. Not that they think of unionization as the immediate answer, but they responded extremely positively to what I was doing. And Adi Barkan was really very struck because he considered the response to be much more positive than he had ever encountered in any kind of canvassing he had done. And later that evening, we went to a labor forum that we had organized, drawing together union members and union officials from unions in the area, including some steelworkers, some people from the Communication Workers of America, someone from the Actors Guild, some people from Public Transport Union and so forth. And again, they were very supportive of the kind of issues that I was bringing up. I think they did definitely recognize that when one speaks about guaranteed jobs, this is not simply an issue for those who do not have work. It also bears upon the situation of those who have jobs, and certainly enhances their ability to fight for better wages and to have the security of being able to fight for their rights in all respects, and know that they will not be left completely destitute in retaliation. And I've had the opportunity to, as I mentioned, to speak before groups of veterans that were both black and white, and I think many of the whites were those who have deserted the Democratic Party and voted Republican, and also in senior centers, and they too respond very, very positively to these issues. So from my own experience, I'm finding that the real question is how many people I can make contact with and get the message to, because the response is uniformly positive, with very few exceptions. And I think that this indicates to me that these policies, besides being right and providing valid solutions to our social difficulties, are a winning strategy. And that we are making a mistake, or at least many are making a mistake if they think that we have to be less bold and gravitate towards the center. Now, of course, as we know, there have been big developments nationally within the Democratic Party, with major figures like Kirsten Gillibrand and Cory Booker, and finally Bernie Sanders himself coming out for some version of a federal job guarantee. And in the wake of that, there have been a lot of articles about how this issue could be the key issue by which the Democratic Party gives itself a new direction that can give it vitality and renew itself. Because as it stands, it's quite clear that labor is tired of being taken for granted by the Democratic Party. Much of the African American community also feels taken for granted by the Democratic Party, and I think for good reason. And I think this kind of agenda will really allow not only for there to be a strong Democratic turnout, but a way of winning over, not necessarily a majority, but enough of a minority of the Republican base to really turn the tables in a very positive direction.
Okay, so a question, how would you compare your job guarantee program
Yes.
to Cory Booker's and to Gillibrand's, okay, and to Bernie's?
Yeah, well, I mean, Cory Booker's seems to be a very limited experimental version. And I haven't really looked at the details of Gillibrand. And my sense is that with Bernie Sanders, as with many of the people who are advocating it in the economics community, people are willing to tie it to a living wage of $15 an hour. Whereas I want to up the ante and want to start with what I consider to be a fair minimum wage of $20 an hour, approximately, which reflects a principle I think it's important to embrace and put into the guaranteed job proposal. That is, that wages should rise in conjunction not just with inflation, but productivity gains. So that, shall we say, all boats rise as the economy generates more and more wealth. And that then that changes the kind of calculations in terms of how expensive the program will be.
Sure.
Since I'm, making the wage factor, a little bit greater. But I've been doing various kinds of calculations of my own, and I when people ask me about the costs, I try to make a case, first of all, that here we're dealing with a program that will largely pay for itself. I come to a total. I also don't want to necessarily incorporate benefits with this, because I want benefits to be detached from the workplace. So I want, for example, a single-payer healthcare system with no copays, no deductibles, that is not going to be funded in connection to the workplace or the work history of someone, but would be funded nationally. to the extent that it needs to be funded. And likewise, with, in some respect, pension benefits. I would like to see them separated from the workplace. Because otherwise, people suffer who don't have a good work history or the kind of work history that has benefits paid into it.
So when you would support a very much expanded Social Security benefit.
Exactly. I want the Social Security benefit and disability benefits to be equal to a fair minimum wage. So going up to about $41,600 a year, which would involve an additional cost, according to my calculations, of about $1.3 trillion annually. But we can subtract from all of these things such savings as we don't need unemployment insurance for all the people who would be put back to work. We don't need food stamps for them. We don't need housing assistance in the same way.
Yes, but just to clarify,
yes,
you would not be for the repeal of those particular programs, but I think what you're saying is they just would simply not be used by people.
Exactly. Exactly. All the people who would have both the jobs, and we're also talking about all employment beginning at $20 an hour, they and those on disability and retirement would now have a sufficient income where they would not need to use any kind of food assistance.
Right, and they wouldn't have to use any subsidies for housing also anymore.
Yes, yes. I mean, obviously, this is to some degree dependent upon how we ensure that there is a supply of affordable housing, besides raising incomes. And part of that would be by putting people to work as part of the job program and providing affordable housing. Right?
Yes.
But I think, we can create a situation where people would not need any of the kind of public assistance housing that many depend upon, especially if we can provide more decent housing that's affordable. And of course,
but so I forget, do you have a cost of living adjustment in your federal job guarantee program?
Yes. I mean, it would be adjusted upward for inflation. And
I'm not speaking of that. Okay, I'm speaking speaking of a locality.
Yes.
CPI adjustment.
I wasn't thinking of doing that because I want to look at this as being a raising of the floor for everyone nationally. And then many of the local conditions that currently make the cost of living higher would be addressed by other parts of my platform. So that many of those...
How could you address the cost of living difference between Athens, Georgia, say, and the largest of our cities?
Well, I think we have. I mean, a very important part of cost of living in many of our cities is the tremendous increase in housing costs.
Yes, it is.
Rentals and so I think we have to think of policies that will reduce that, and to be aggressive in that regard. And I think I would like to see a complete moratorium on evictions, foreclosures, and utility cutoffs for people who are unable to pay because of lack of income or because I think when we supply everyone with a fair wage, we have a steady stream of income that can be tapped. We can reschedule payments. Of course, we can remove healthcare costs, which become a major factor in personal bankruptcies. We can eliminate student debt. We can, in many respects, free people of all sorts of financial drains, which make housing unaffordable for them. But I think we also have to think of setting a federal framework where localities can do things such as have aggressive rent control, rent stabilization policies, such as I once benefited long ago when I was living in New York City, in Manhattan.
Yes.
In a rent-stabilized apartment that was very affordable. And I think there's no reason why one can't renew and expand those kind of situations. So in a sense, I would rather have a national minimum And I don't consider $20 an hour to be extravagant in any way. Because if you do the math, our national income is over $18 trillion. There are only about, according to the figures I found, about 160 million people who are actually breadwinners. So you divide the national income by breadwinners, you get an average of $112,000 a year as what would be the average income. Yet I think only 6 or 7% of Americans, breadwinners, actually make six figures or more. So we have incredible inequality of income. There's certainly room where we can bring up the floor this amount. And then on that basis, localities could have higher minimums. It could respond to the particular situations of the cost of living. But on the other hand, we can aggressively try to keep those costs in control and free people of the additional costs, such as obviously in a metropolitan city, childcare, elder care is very expensive. So if we have free public childcare, free public elder care, as other countries have done, then we remove that as an issue. So I think that there are ways of making it work and dealing with what today are these excessive differences in cost of living. We don't have to take that as given and as something that we just have to accept and cope with.
We've had a situation here in the United States for a very long time where the companies, the very large companies, have been essentially leading a race to the bottom.
Yes.
By states, okay, and also localities. They give all kinds of tax breaks to large businesses.
Sure.
And so the states don't have revenue as a result, and their programs suffer at the state level. We used to have, during the Carter administration, okay, and the Nixon administration too, and Ford as well, the revenue sharing programs, and those were appreciable programs. Okay, at one time, there was a program within the Department of Agriculture that was run by a farmers' home administration, and the FMHA was known somewhat for discriminating against poor black farmers.
Yes.
But as a generalized kind of endeavor, it really poured a lot of loan money and grant money into rural areas across the country. At the height of the program, which I guess was in the late the 1980s, it was actually spending $80 billion a year on those programs. And then they were cut down considerably by the Clinton period, and then after Clinton, they were basically destroyed by Bush completely. And so there wasn't this particular flow of money into the rural sector in the states. There used to also be community development grants from HUD, which were considerable for the rural areas, and they were revenue sharing grants also, that came out of the federal government. And that was scaled down over the years. So basically, what I'm asking is, would you support, or do you have any policies providing for the return of those kinds of programs, which were once extremely successful in supplementing the tax revenues of the states.
Sure. I mean, I think that when you go to the rural areas in my district, you see areas that are losing population. The opportunities for employment are more and more limited. Even though there's all this talk about how the unemployment rate has reached a low compared to what it's been in many decades. In these areas, people are very much concerned with there not being enough employment opportunities. And what employment opportunities there are pay poverty wages.
Yes.
And needless to say, there's very, very little union representation in these areas. And what you find in these very neglected areas, you find a small little town, and its downtown will have 3/4, 7/8 of its stores boarded up.
Yes.
And this has been happening progressively. And if you ask what is the major employer, in not that few cases, it turns out to be a prison. That's going to be the biggest employer. And of course, Georgia, like much of the United States, has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. And of course, there are for-profit prisons. And otherwise, we're dealing with a place of complete neglect. And I think that the federal job guarantee will be one very important factor in rejuvenating rural areas, because we can do things by putting people to work, bringing broadband everywhere. As once electrification took place under the New Deal, rural electrification, we can have a national broadband element. One can ensure that everyone has a reasonable amount of income, which will allow a certain amount of retail trade to return to these towns. One can improve all the public facilities, the schools. In many cases, it's very hard for school districts to find teachers. First of all, there's not much of an adequate supply of housing. And of course, there are very few employment opportunities for the spouses of any people who come there. So I think the guaranteed job is an important factor. And I think that also, by the way, has a great impact in the race to the bottom of communities trying to give tax breaks to lure employers into their areas. Because if one has a federal job guarantee, communities can hang tough. They don't have to offer anything, any tax breaks of any sort to employers. And we can make use of the federal job guarantee to have obviously, not just a major infrastructure, rebuild green energy and so forth, but the kind of human services that are lacking. The public transportation is completely absent in these areas. And then the cultural opportunities. I mean, this is a cultural wasteland.
Yes.
When you go into these districts, there is no support for the arts. There are no arts to be practiced. The schools are cutting back on art and music classes. But we could put people to work and rejuvenate all the side. If you go to some of these small little towns, what is really a sad spectacle, there's really not much of anything for people to do except go to church. The churches themselves are struggling because the people who attend them simply don't have the money to support the activities of the church itself.
So the job guarantee is a wonderful thing to wake up economies all across the United States.
And to raise the bottom in terms of a fair minimum wage.
Absolutely.
Transform things. Now, another aspect of, in a sense, the predicament of the race to the bottom is I went recently, as I mentioned to you earlier, one of the union meetings that I went to was I went to a large UPS facility in a little town called Bogart outside of Athens. And the Teamsters local official had me meet with people as they came out of their shifts. And you're in a situation now, they're coming up for new contract negotiations, and they're facing two looming major threats to their jobs and their situation. One is the arrival, at some point, not too distant from us, of self-driving trucks. and how that will be handled. The other is Amazon. Because
Yes.
Amazon, as we all know, this incredible monopoly that, of course, is completely non-union, with no employee empowerment, they are threatening to do their own deliveries. And
Yes, of course.
Amazon boxes and purchases now make up a very significant part of UPS deliveries. So what is management doing in face of all these things? They want to have a new contract. They're trying to increase the amount of part-time employment as much as possible and reduce
Yes.
full-time employment.
So they don't have to cover the fringe benefits.
Yes. And they already have a lot of part-time people who come there early in the morning and load the trucks, receive the semi-trailers that come, and they're coming from across the country. And they have people who come in for a shift of maybe 4 or 5 hours, very early in the morning. And then they go to another job. On the other hand, what the company is doing, as is the case with many companies in the United States, they're taking advantage of something that has been prohibited in many countries. Namely, they have mandatory overtime.
Yes.
So people are having to work extremely long hours, and they don't get much forewarning about them. So it really wrecks their family life and their ability to do things with their children. So if you think of this historically, 120 years ago, the American workers were aflame trying to have a 40-hour work week, an 8-hour work day. Well, now we're in a situation, because we allow for mandatory overtime, where people are once again working 12 hours a day. Now, they may be paid overtime in union shops. Many places they're not paid overtime because they're treated as if they're contract employees.
Yes.
We're not covered by this. That's another part of the race to the bottom. So I'm thinking that we really have to think about doing something that other countries have done, which is to prohibit mandatory overtime.
Yes, I think that's a great idea.
And I think that is something that many workers would very much like to happen, because they really are under this tremendous degree of manipulation, even when they have unions, because the unions have not been able to break this. At least not yet. So I think that might be something that would require a legislative solution, so that we can really say that we have something like a 40-hour work week. And of course, we could eventually reduce it to less than that.
Of course.
I mean, it's been more than 100 years. There's no reason why it has to be here, right?
Yes, it's time to go down to 35 hours or 30 hours or something like that.
So I think also with regard to, you take a company like UPS, which is making all of these very important decisions in terms of how they're going to introduce further automation, how they're dealing with the balance of part-time and full-time work. Well, we can change their ability to do that from the inside by introducing one of my platform points, which is worker co-determination, or as it's done in Europe, where we would have the board of directors have half their seats reserved for employees elected by their peers.
Yes.
I think that will change things from within in a very significant way, because there are certainly different ways of handling automation, very different ways of handling the balance between part-time and full-time work. Obviously, I think we want to ensure that everyone has full-time employment, at least the option for that, if they want it. And then,
yes,
of course,
which the federal job guarantee would do.
Yes, yeah, it definitely could.
Yes.
And I think there would be great support for these kind of measures, because as we all know, Americans are working longer hours than workers in any other developed nation.
Yes.
And we're not.
You are finding great support for it in your district.
Yeah.
Which is not known for being a very progressive district.
Yes.
And it seems like the support is highly nonpartisan.
Well, I found, for example, when I was canvassing in an area which was unique in that it actually was sort of low, I would say, inexpensive small houses, the kind of houses that I could imagine had tremendous amounts of foreclosure in 2008. But it was a community that was actually integrated. And I rarely come upon a community in the districts that is truly integrated. We would have houses side by side, some with African Americans, some with whites.
Yeah.
But I spoke to a white mechanic who was making more than $20 an hour. But what really bothered him was the fact that he had no job security. He could be fired at will. Now, he wasn't talking about unions. I don't think unions are at all on his horizon. I remember myself, I don't know if you experienced this, when I went to public school in the New York area, we had a class as part of our social studies curriculum, which was about unions, the history of the labor movement in the United States.
Yes, we had a class like that too.
Well, you can be sure there's nothing like that down here in Georgia.
I'm sure there's but to be fair, I'm not sure there's anything like that in the New York City public schools right now either.
Well, maybe right. But it contributes to the fact that people just don't know anything about unions, have no sense of what they've contributed, and just if they hear anything about it, it's pejorative things coming from the kind of media or that have nothing good to say about unions.
Yeah, the corporate-owned media.
Yeah, exactly.
That is desperate itself to resist unions and unionization.
Yeah.
So highly biased.
Yes.
In that respect. Okay, I don't think we spoke very much in our other interviews about your foreign policy preferences.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to give you a chance to say some things about that.
Sure. I mean, essentially, I feel that we cannot be the unilateral policeman of the world. I think that we should try to strive for international cooperation wherever we can. We should go first to the United Nations if there's any need to think about any kind of international interventions. And I think if we find the United Nations is not willing to do things that ought to be done, we have other regional alliances that can be used, NATO and so forth. And, we should always think of any unilateral intervention as absolutely a last resort. And I think that we really should think of other kinds of interventions as opposed to military or military support. We as a nation give less non-military aid to other nations in proportion to our GNP than most other nations. Yes. And we're also not keeping up with, I think, what would be our legitimate responsibilities to take in refugees. We're taking considerably less than what we should be doing in comparison to other nations. So I think, we have special responsibilities because, first of all, we're still the largest economy. We still remain the biggest military power with the most extensive military network. And whether we like it or not, that means that we do have the power to do things that other nations can't possibly do. And I think that, admittedly, we ought to be thinking about restricting our activities to what truly is in the interest of upholding our own democracy. But I think there are circumstances where there is a need for humanitarian intervention. And we have put ourselves in the position that because we have the resources and abilities, we have decisions to make that Holland will not have to make, or some other nations that simply don't have the resources. But I think we obviously our military dispersion, first of all, is wider than it needs to be under any circumstances for our international military organization. Much of it has to do with a Cold War that no longer exists and a kind of ideological opposition that doesn't quite exist any longer. I think, for example, I mentioned this to you before, that if we really want to have a settlement, a denuclearization of North Korea, the logical deal to be drawn is not simply to say we're not going to invade you, but to basically remove our troops from the Korean Peninsula and have a treaty signed. I think China would love that. I don't think there's any reason for Japan to necessarily be worried about that. And I think these are the kind of disengagements that are feasible. And I do think that we can move in terms of foreign relations, much more aggressively towards nuclear disarmament. We can unilaterally reduce much of our armaments. We should not engage in any kind of, I don't think, any kind of updating of our nuclear weapons. Obama was starting a huge program in that direction. It's going to cost, I think, more than $1 trillion if it were to be followed up. I think we should not do that. We should negotiate with the Russians drastic cuts to nuclear weapons so that no nation has the capability of precipitating any kind of nuclear holocaust. And also, we should get rid of the button. No leader should be able, no individual should have the ability to set off a nuclear war. And we should do it, we should reduce the weapons in such a way that we don't have to worry about a first strike by anyone else.
So it sounds like you would be for major cuts to the military budget.
In all of these respects, it would seem that we have a lot of military expenditures that have nothing to do with either our own security or whatever humanitarian interventions could arise on the horizon. Because I think we do have a responsibility, and hopefully to be fulfilled with international cooperation, to stop the worst kind of humanitarian outrages that I'm afraid will continue to happen. And the international community should not just sit on the sidelines, even if it doesn't mean that we are directly defending our own security.
So have you any feel for the kinds, of budget cuts that could be necessary if we follow the foreign policy direction that you're suggesting?
Yeah, well, I think we have a lot of expenditures in terms of nuclear weapon maintenance, modernization. I think all of that should be drastically reduced. We have a tremendous amount of extremely expensive weapon development programs.
Yes,
that are geared to a Cold War that no longer exists, like the F-35 fighter and all of these things. I think those also are completely unnecessary. We don't need as many aircraft carrier groups as we do. I haven't really thought about what number we could reduce them to, but we certainly have more than we need. And each of them is both very expensive in its own right and expensive to maintain. So I think I don't like the way in which our Army has been relying upon outsourcing many of its activities, which seem to me to increase expenditures dramatically. There are ways of having the military operate in a much more cost-efficient way in general.
Okay, so since I spoke to you last, we spoke about some different ways, of financing things, and I think I pointed out to you that taxes do not actually fund spending. And you were mainly counting on tax increases or favoring tax increases in order to pay for.
Well, I did calculations in terms of the cost of everything I'm proposing, and because as I've mentioned, there are many things, there are many savings involved in these programs, in particular healthcare costs.
Yes.
Removing social costs, that I came up with a final aggregate net cost of these programs is something like about $1.25 trillion. That would have to be dealt with in one way or another. And if one wanted to...
were you talking about $1.25 trillion above what we spend now?
This would be in terms of the costs. In a sense, I wouldn't say that, because we've just been mentioning cuts in military spending, and we could also speak about other cuts, such as subsidies given to the fossil fuel industry, come to $20 billion a year, and other kinds, and of course all the tax giveaways of various sorts. So leaving that aside, just the cost of the new programs I'm putting forward, they would have a net cost of about 1.2. $5 trillion annually.
Okay, and that kind of calculation involves taking into account the monies that would not be spent on the safety net, but due to what the job guarantee brings to the table.
And what I did not enter in is the value of the goods and services provided by the job. I didn't give a figure for that. So that could actually reduce much of this even further. But if one wanted to take the route of thinking of it being financed by taxes, or at least having the appearance of that, I realize that, some people want to regard it as merely a kind of epiphenomenon of sorts of transfers. But I think if we want to think about how taxes should be designed, I think we want to put the burden of new programs that would be paid for or accounted for in terms of taxes by relying on highly graduated wealth and, if necessary, income taxes. It would only affect the top 10% of the population. And I think if one considers that the top 1% of possessors of wealth have as much wealth as the bottom 90%, we're now speaking about the top 1% having what's approaching $50 trillion. One could have a wealth tax that would be quite low in terms of the percentages. They could easily cover all of these expenses.
Okay, well, I'm not opposing a wealth tax in principle at all. I think there are a number of reasons to tax, which are extremely good reasons to tax. Okay, so I'm going to put them up here for a minute. Okay, as a solo thing.
Yeah.
And okay, so you can see the list there. Okay, I'll give this now on solo so you can see it better. That taxes drive the value of the currency.
Yeah.
They reduce the demand in the economy to stabilize the purchasing power, stop inflation, okay, in other words. They can express public policy in the distribution of wealth, okay, and of income.
Yes.
Okay, and that's an important function, okay, because when you say that we now have a maldistribution of wealth and a great deal, okay, of inequality, you're also pointing to something that is a danger to our democracy.
Yes, and I think also a drag on our economy.
And a drag on the economy. Okay, so there are public policy reasons for wanting a tax on the wealthy, and even for wanting higher taxes on the top 10%. Okay, or so. Okay, but then there's also expressing public policy and subsidizing, okay, or penalizing various industries, okay, and economic groups in our population. And the kind of thing we have in mind here is sin taxes. In other words, behavior we want to discourage through taxation, rather than simply declaring it as illegal and trying to enforce that through sending people to jail. And then there's a final reason, which is to isolate and assess directly the costs of some of the benefits, okay, we give to people, such as highways and perhaps also to Social Security. We have that now for Social Security. I don't think we should. Okay, but it might actually make sense to tax certain benefits that do not go to everybody, but that only go to certain people. So since those people, okay, are benefiting from the benefits, then it makes sense to say, well, they are the ones who should be taxed for the benefits. Okay, so that's a fourth reason.
Yep.
Okay, so these are very good reasons to tax. And so when somebody says taxes do not fund spending, they're not saying do not tax.
Yeah.
Okay, they're saying that the money doesn't land into the Treasury spending account, okay, by virtue of the taxation. It lands in the Treasury spending account for other reasons. Okay, and in an earlier interview, I put up legislative language for what I called overt congressional financing. And I think I showed that to you at the time, if I recall correctly. Well, of course, I received some feedback on that with people telling me, okay, that's great, but how can a candidate actually use that in a campaign? So I thought about that, and I thought about that, and I thought about that. And I thought to myself, this really has to be simplified so it can be put into a one-liner. And so I got myself a one-liner here. And so here's the one-liner for candidates to consider. Okay. Basically, it's your programs look expensive. How are you going to pay for them? Okay, and the answer I gave, which summarizes the simple language, okay, that I gave you before, is we're Congress. We'll just order the Fed to give Treasury the money. Then, if any further questions of that are asked about that, read Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution. Okay, it says we can do that. Okay, and we certainly can. And so, with respect to any program, if people are trying to put you into the box of saying, well, we're going to raise taxes to pay for this, then all you have to do is say, well, we're going to pay for it by ordering the Fed to give Treasury the money. Now, whether we want to tax to pay, at the same time, okay, that we legislate this program, that's another decision. Okay, there are different kinds of reasons for taxing. One reason is if we spend too much, then we can have inflation. Okay, we don't want to have inflation, so we have to tax enough to stop that. But we don't have to tax actually further than that. And there are very good reasons to think that in the type of economy we have today, we have to run federal deficits that are in the neighborhood of 12% of GDP per year, which at the moment is roughly $2.4 trillion. So just in terms of deficit spending,
you're saying that because of concerns of inflation, if one were to reduce that, in other words, on your terms, order the Fed to give the Treasury sufficient money to not have a deficit.
No, I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that we need to have a deficit because 12% of GDP each year, okay, would be, if we had a prosperous economy, 12% of GDP per year would be leaking out of the economy. 6% of GDP would probably be going to savings, private savings, where it would stay idle. Okay, and another 6% would probably be going to trade, okay, because we'd have a trade deficit, which would be the size, okay, of 6%, okay, of GDP. Now, we know these figures are approximately correct, but because during the Bush administration, we had trade deficits that actually reached 6%, okay, or 7%, okay, something like that. And but during some earlier times, the public showed that it had an appetite to save but 6%, okay, of GDP. In fact, in the early Obama years, while the stimulus, okay, was flowing, but private sector savings were rising even to 7%, okay, 8%, okay, as high as that, okay, of GDP. Okay, so anyway, when you add the leakages to the economy together, you can sort of predict that.
Would you agree that the savings are not necessarily being leaked out of the economy, but are also being used by financial institutions?
No, because financial institutions don't actually use savings to actually make loans. In other words, when a financial institution actually makes a loan, it takes your notes, and then it has the authority of the Federal Reserve to issue you the deposit funds against, in other words, to credit your checking account, okay, with the amount of the loan. It doesn't use any savings for that purpose. Your savings actually never leave the bank. Okay. So that's a misunderstanding, okay, that people have about how financial institutions actually work, okay, in these days. Okay, so anyway, okay. So those savings actually do sit in the bank, okay, and they are not actually used by the bank. Of course, they sit in the bank, okay, in electronic form, okay. They're not in a physical form, okay, like in cash, okay, or anything like that. Okay, so the point being so you have this 12%, which in a prosperous economy, a full employment economy, which is the kind of economy that you want to create, okay, there would be 12% of GDP that would be leaking from the economy each year. So the point is, how can we compensate for that? There is only one way to compensate, and that's for the federal government to run a deficit of 12%. Now, right now, 12% of GDP is $2.4 trillion. So that's the amount of policy space the federal government has before inflation caused by demand pull would be likely to set in. Okay, now there might be other causes of inflation, okay, like supply side inflation, cost push inflation,
things that could mitigate against inflation as well,
and things that could mitigate against inflation as well. But just from the government source of inflation. In spending, okay, the government in a full employment type of economy would, at this point in time, have $2.4 trillion per year in policy space beyond what it taxes away from the private sector. Okay? So that $2.4 trillion, by the way, would easily account for, with room to spare, the $1.25 trillion that you've calculated as the net cost, okay, of what you want to do. In fact, it seems clear that if there's that kind of need for deficit spending, that there would be no need for you actually to impose higher taxes. Now, there might be a need to redistribute the tax burden, okay, because it seems like it's too low for certain groups in our population, and too high, okay, for other groups in the population. So there might be that kind of need, okay, to change tax policy. But in terms of total taxation, you would not have to tax more to actually create the money to spend. Actually, the way that you'd be able to create it is by simply ordering the Federal Reserve to place it in the Treasury spending account. Okay, now that also has a side benefit. And the side benefit is that in the more detailed language, okay, that I suggested, half of that language is actually devoted to the point that you also give a sufficient amount of money to the Treasury Department to pay back the debt instruments that are falling due, okay, in any period of time. So if you use this particular method of financing spending, then over a period of time, your debt actually falls to zero, and the debt issue itself is dead within 6 months' time, because we have so much debt that's falling due in 6 months' time that it would be visible that we had paid off $4 trillion worth of the national debt in that shorter time. So this would kill the debt industry but in the DC area. They no longer would be able to terrorize everybody with the size of the inevitably increasing national debt. In other words, that issue would always be gone from the table. Okay. Okay, so again, I wanted to show you this and to show you how short a response could be made, but to the how you're going to pay for it question.
But I think what makes that short response, I think, will appear implausible is one has to make some argument to the effect that will not have inflationary results.
Well, okay, if they ask you the inflationary question, if they followed up with the inflationary question, then you answer that question. Okay, but the important point here is to separate the solvency issue from whether you're going to have an inflationary response or not. Okay, and the reason for that, okay, is actually a political reason that historically speaking, okay, but until the 1970s, when we had the high inflation caused by the oil inflation and by the Federal Reserve driving up the interest rate continuously, it was always possible for the progressives, okay, or the liberals, okay, at that time, to argue for deficit spending on the basis that it was more important to have a full employment economy than to completely contain inflation. In other words, in that argument, we won from 1945 to the 1970s. We began to lose the argument but during the 1970s, when the cost push type of inflation happened, and the Keynesians weren't able to explain it. Okay, and they weren't able to show that it was not due to government spending, in spite of the fact that that Jimmy Carter had very small deficits at the time. Okay, so if we can separate the two issues, dispose of the solvency issue and dispose of the debt issue, and pare it down to the inflation issue, I think we can win the argument again, and again, and again.
I mean, but there also has to be some indication of of what are the limits within which the Fed can take these measures. Because I don't think it's plausible that it's completely unlimited.
No, it isn't. It is not completely unlimited. What I said to you,
it fits within.
Right. Okay. But what I said to you just a short while ago is that the federal government has $2.4 trillion worth of deficit policy space. It can't go over the 2.4 trillion. If it does go over the 2.4 trillion, there's going to be an inflation caused by deficit spending. So it's not the case, okay, that there is no limit. There's definitely a limit. It's just far larger than we think it is right now. In other words, everybody is getting panicked about the tax cuts, and our deficits are going to rise to 850 billion, okay, and then to $1 trillion. Well, maybe so, but that's still not as large as the type of deficit that we should be running. And besides, lots of the $850 billion deficit gets accounted for by the new tax cuts for the wealthy. And we know their multiplier effect is very small. It's only about 30 cents on the dollar.
And I think that's an important factor to keep into consideration regarding the importance of having such things as a wealth tax to reduce the amount of wealth that is in hands that have such a reduced multiplier effect, as opposed to transferring in such a way that we have much more of a multiplier effect, much more economic growth, in other words.
Yes, I agree, but actually from the standpoint of inflation, the fact that it has a low multiplier effect is actually a good thing when you're thinking about the $2.4 trillion worth of policy space for deficit spending. When you're spending perhaps 150 billion per year, okay, if that is due to tax cuts for the wealthy, that only produces a force of 30 cents on the dollar in the economy. Well, actually, those tax cuts are not going to be very inflationary. Okay, in other words, if the average tax cut per year is at $150 billion, so that over 10 years, okay, it's a $1.5 trillion tax cut. So then the multiplier, or I shouldn't say that, but the inflationary force, okay, for a year is something like $45 billion or something like that, $46 billion off the top of my head. It's a fairly minor inflationary impact on the economy. But, okay, in any case, when you have a situation where your deficit spending is going to low multiplier things like that, why are they low multiplier things? Because the rich have a higher propensity to stick the money in the bank, okay, or to buy back stocks with it.
Stocks, yeah, sure.
Okay, and which do not have too much of an impact on the Main Street economy in the United States. Okay. So because of that, then if you have a lot of those kinds of expenditures, then it follows that you might even have more policy space than the $2.4 trillion.
Do you think that taxation can increase policy, the policy possibilities beyond the 2.4?
Well, yes, because Okay, taxation destroys money. Okay.
Well, it also ends up spending, right, the tax revenues and
Well, what I'm saying
monetary
is
exchange as
that
well.
in fact, okay, the tax revenues are not spent.
Yeah.
However, when the tax settlement is made at the Federal Reserve, okay, the tax money that was paid in is removed from the private sector. It's gone at that point. Okay, and since it's gone, uh, okay, so that means there's been a leakage from the
But then, but
economy
then, but
that's
then it
due to
can't be.
tax. And that means that there's more space for deficit spending. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
But then, of course, it can also be spent and on the wages for people put to work,
Yes,
for the various services that are provided, etc.
yes. Okay, I shouldn't say that it increases the deficit spending.
Yeah.
What it does is create a requirement for the federal government to spend in order to make up for the tax leakage. Okay. However, in that case, that would not actually be deficit spending because the taxes would have taken money away from the economy.
But I mean,
Okay.
we would have a room. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that
And
the
we have even more
$2.4
room. Yes.
trillion figure is not an absolute barrier. It's
Right.
possible to transgress it if we need to, or if
You're
we
right. Okay. If we needed to spend more than $2.4 trillion, okay, we certainly would be making room for that. Okay. If we tax more. Okay. If we tax another $600 billion per year, we would be making more space for federal spending. Yes, absolutely. Okay.
And by the
So,
way, I'll say this when I go out and speak about these various programs. The
okay.
people who are interested in them, they are not at all worried about the feasibility of being able to pay for them. They see them as being very, very realizable, and they're not particularly worried about the kind of concerns that opponents might be thought to express.
Okay. So
Even though I
base.
must say their eyes open up as if we're presenting them with a dream. On the
Yeah.
other hand, they realize that it's both just and it's doable. That we have the resources at our disposal to make these changes.
Okay. That is great. What I'd like to speak. What I'd like you to speak to now.
Yes.
Okay, as a final thing. Okay, is to tell our people what you need to win this campaign.
I mean, at
In
this
other
point,
words,
yeah.
What kind of help I need.
I mean, on the one hand, I can use volunteer help of people to get out both phone banking and to get involved in canvassing, because as I mentioned, there is this problem that there are many people who just don't know that there is an election or who the candidates are. On the other hand, contributions are important so that we can fund various ways of trying to reach the electorate, both in terms of potentially even hiring canvassers, although so far we haven't done that, but also of trying to get the message out through more radio exposure and other kind of ways of reaching them. You know, we don't have too much time left for this part of this this adventure.
Right, because the primary is on May 22nd.
May 22nd. But people can contribute, and they can also sign on to volunteer, some of which can be done remotely by going to the campaign website, winfieldforcongress.com, which is all spelled out, F-O-R, WINFIELD, Congress.com. You know, we definitely can use funding. even though I may have outraised my opponents, we're still talking about relatively small amounts compared to any of the major campaigns where you have established party figures, where you have any kind of major contributors coming into play.
Okay, so friends,
goes a long way in this area.
Okay, so friends, that is very good news. Okay, that Richard so far has outraised the opponents in the primary through small donations. He's running a small donation campaign.
I have not received anything other than individual contributions. No groups have provided any funding. Of course, no PACs, etc.
And also no unions even, right?
Not yet. And there's not too much time left for them to do so. I think many of them are sitting on the sidelines, waiting until after the primary.
The good thing is that they're not against you so far.
No, they're definitely not against me. But many of their decisions on expenditures are done at either the state or national level. And I think there's a reluctance, first of all, to get involved in a primary race to begin with, since I think still many people in many organizations, including labor unions, are simply concerned that a Democrat wins, that this district turned blue, irrespective of what the Democrat stands for. And then on the other hand, there's a kind of skepticism that in what have been heavily red districts like my own, the 10th district, that this is not the place to put our resources.
Yes.
We should concentrate on the ones where in the past it's been a much closer race.
Yes.
So that is something that I'm dealing with, and so it means our campaign is not particularly well funded, but it's we're holding our own, or more than holding our own, vis-a-vis the opposition. It'll be a different story if I win the primary and then we have the final race, because then we will be facing an opponent who will be much better funded than people in the Democratic primary. But I hope by then this will become a race that gains national attention.
And there's a good chance of that, I think. If you win the primary and you're running on a job guarantee of $20 per hour, there's a very good chance that you're going to have national attention.
I hope so.
And also with respect to the new Social Bill of Rights,
yes,
which is very extensive and very much needed.
Yes.
So everybody, but please go to Richard's site, to Winfield for Congress, .com, and read the platform in detail. Read the issues discussion in detail. Okay, and you will see that this is the kind of candidate that we want in Congress.
Well,
so thank you, Richard, for coming here tonight.
Okay, and thank you for giving me a chance to discuss the issues at length. It's very hard to find that opportunity in the media as it stands.
Okay, it's always a pleasure, Richard.
Okay, well, thank you, and I hope
Okay, so good luck on the 22nd.
Thank you. Thank you.
And should you win, then shortly after that, I'll get back with you for a little celebration here.
Sure.
Okay.
So I think this can be a turning point. This little primary here in the 10th district. So
I certainly hope so.
Worth keeping track of what happens on the 22nd. So.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I'm going to take you out of the program now.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Have a very good night and a very good weekend.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Okay, friends. So that's going to be just about it for tonight, but I want to remind you that Real Progressives has a Patreon account. And we would very much like to see you occasionally contribute to it on a continuing basis, if possible. Okay, and I too have a Patreon account. Okay, and I would appreciate something every once in a while for my work. But of course, okay, as always, okay, I appreciate you all for coming, and for being here, and for discussing things. And so, good night. I will be back at 10:30 with Brian Rosser, who is another candidate from Georgia, this time from the Georgia 14th District. And his primary is on the 22nd, okay, of May as well. So thank you very much. And I'm going to end with this broadcast for now. Thanks.